I'm Tim Perkin, and I will be discussing the state of ISP regulation in the United States. I must confess that at the time of creating this, I had not looked ahead in the modules, and this presentation may better fall under the category of net neutrality policy. However, I don't completely understand the distinction between general net neutrality and net neutrality policy, since net neutrality is an issue of regulation. So first, to understand the current state of net neutrality, we must understand the Communications Act of 1934, which created the FCC and which is the backbone for how ISPs are regulated. Obviously, since the Communications Act of 1934 was created in 1934, it does not specifically account for internet service providers, which means the FCC has some leeway in how it interprets the act. So under the Communications Act, ISPs could be classified as Title I information services or Title II common carrier services. And this creates a major difference in how ISPs can be regulated by the FCC. So by the text of the law, an information service is, quote, the offering of a capability for generating, acquiring, storing, transforming, processing, retrieving, utilizing, or making available information via telecommunications, and includes electronic publishing, but does not include any use of such capability for the management, control, or operation of a telecommunications system, or the management of a telecommunications service. It's worth noting a telecommunications service is the offering, quote, of telecommunications for a fee directly to the public or to such classes of users as to be effectively available to the public, regardless of the facilities used. Now, if ISPs were instead classified under Title II as common carriers, they are, quote, person engaged as common carrier for hire in interstate or foreign communication by wire or radio, or an interstate or foreign radio transmission of energy, except where reference is made to common carriers not subject to this act, but a person engaged in radio broadcasting shall not, insofar as such a person is so engaged, be deemed a common carrier. So the FCC has a different capacity to regulate information services and common carrier services. It has little power to regulate Title I services at all, partly due to First Amendment concerns, because those would be, in a sense, the publishing of information. Whereas the FCC can strongly regulate Title II services, and they are required to be neutral. Quote, it shall be unlawful for any common carrier to make any unjust or unreasonable discrimination in charges, practices, classifications, regulations, facilities, or services for in connection with like communication service directly or indirectly by any means or device, or to make or give any undue or unreasonable preference or advantage to any particular person, class of persons, or locality, or subject any particular person, class of persons, or locality to any undue or unreasonable prejudice and disadvantage. This is interpreted in the context of internet service providers as requiring some form of net neutrality and forbidding ISPs from deciding which communications get priority or precedence, and preventing ISPs from being able to shut down certain communication. So originally, the FCC classified ISPs under Title I. Now, the FCC was upholding the principle of net neutrality since 2005 in its rules. However, its ability to enforce those rules was questionable and did not always hold up in court. So, though net neutrality was often followed to avoid issues with the FCC did not have a strong ability to enforce. It was at that time using rules under Section 706 of the Telecommunications Act of 1996, which does not actually state in the same way that the Communications Act of 36 says it does not actually specify that discrimination of telecommunications is forbidden for information service. However, this changed in 2015 when ISPs were reclassified as common carriers. This happened in response to a drafted 2014 FCC order, which would have explicitly allowed, plain and clear, would have allowed internet service providers to selectively provide internet service to different web services at different rates, effectively removing net neutrality as clearly as possible. So this was a reaction to that. They were reclassified as common carriers, and net neutrality was now strongly enforceable by the FCC. So this did not last very long. President Trump had publicly opposed classifying ISPs under Title II as early as 2014. He tweeted, quote, "Obama's attack on the internet is another top-down power grab. Net neutrality is the fairness doctrine, will target conservative media." This led to some people, particularly on the American political right, opposing net neutrality. So when President Trump was elected, he appointed FCC Chairman Ajit Pai, who immediately began reducing regulations on ISPs, and on June 11th, 2018, the FCC issued the Restoring Internet Freedom Order, which restored ISP classification under Title I, which fully removes net neutrality. So despite what popular narrative might say, net neutrality as it is usually talked about existed only from 2015 to 2018. Well, the response, this order was very unpopular. Many web services such as YouTube, Google, Reddit, and many more benefit from a neutral ISP because otherwise ISPs could force these web services to pay more money in order to get high bandwidth connection to their consumers. So there were many different movements against this order that were started, leading over 20 million people to write to the FCC. However, the order was passed. 22 states, and along with Mozilla and Vimeo, together filed suit against the FCC to try to restore ISP classifications under Title II. But in the in the Mozilla versus FCC decision on October 1st, 2019, the Court of Appeals upheld the reclassification of ISPs while nullifying the order's limitations on net neutrality enforcement on the state level. So as stands, states can enforce net neutrality, but it is not enforced on the federal level in the United States. And just as recently as February 6th, the appeals court declined to reconsider this decision, so as long as the FCC is classifying ISPs under Title I, this is not going to be legally reevaluated, and net neutrality as it existed from 2015 to 2018 is not going to exist. So there are two sides of this issue, one of which is far more popular among most internet users, but there are some nuances here worth understanding. Of course, in this short video, I can't explain both sides in extreme detail, but those in favor of net neutrality will argue that net neutrality is necessary to ensure a free internet since most ISPs have local monopolies, so people don't actually have a market to choose from, and often these monopolies are created by the state when planning is done. They only account for having one ISP in the region, and in that case, the argument is that the government ought to limit the power of the ISPs to take advantage of that monopoly. Also, they would argue that Net neutrality prevents censorship and restriction of competition. ISPs would not be able to throttle connection to a web service that is a competition for one of their services, which is something that had happened before 2015. Net neutrality allows new web services to find consumers more easily, and net neutrality limits an ISP's ability to extract as much money as possible from web services and consumers. Those against net neutrality will argue that unregulated internet service allows for protectionist measures against outlier bandwidth use on some internet services. Consider in particular when BitTorrent had first become popular, there was a huge strain on many local networks, which damaged the network for all people using it, because there would be some users that were using far more than the expected amount of bandwidth use by using BitTorrent, mostly for illegal means, if you had to guess. By being able to slow down these kinds of services, it would prevent the strain that can happen on local internet service for that person's neighbors. They'd also argue that unregulated internet service enables more granular purchasing options for different use cases. So if you only intend to use your internet connection for a few main core tasks along with a few other tasks, you might want to pick and choose what you're spending money on so that you get a high bandwidth connection for the tasks that you need that for without having to pay for that connection for all the tasks that you use the internet for. Those against net neutrality would also argue that repealing net neutrality gives ISPs greater power to restrict bad actors, those who are spreading malware, or those who are performing illegal activities on the network that's slowing down the network. It gives ISPs powers to deal with that directly without having to involve legal processes. And they might argue that net neutrality is an overbearing and unnecessary regulation, and that the internet up until 2015 had actually functioned well without the ISPs being classified as Title II common carriers. So this leaves us with a few questions. First, by the text of the law, are ISPs better classified as Title I information services or Title II common carriers? Second, how should future legislation classify ISPs? Third, should the FCC enforce net neutrality? Thank you.